There's this narrative out there that says that science arose in Christian Europe in spite of the antagonism of the religious authorities there against reason, and that the scientific revolution was this inevitable triumph of reason over superstition. And that's a popular sentiment, but how true is it? And in considering that question, one of the first things that stands out for me is that the rigors of the scientific method did not appear anywhere else in human history. No other civilization or culture was able to provide for or to encourage the necessary scholarly disciplines enthusiastically enough to produce something as comprehensive as the scientific method. And I want you to really think about that for a second, because we're told that for the last 50,000 years, human beings have been employing cognitive thinking, but it's only within the past 500 years, which is like 1% of that time period, that we made the last major strides towards something like the scientific method. And I want to make sure that you're not misinterpreting what I'm saying, because there had been scientific-like inquiry long before that, but it wasn't the same as a systematic approach to gathering observations and then interpreting that data in a consistently logical way. Other civilizations had things like mathematics and natural philosophy and technology, but none of those things amounted to something as rigorous or as complete as the scientific method, which only appeared in Christian Europe during the Renaissance, which was aided significantly by the Catholic scholastic forerunners. Based on that understanding, it shouldn't be hard to see that science wasn't this inevitable outcome, but rather this very elusive step in intellectual inquiry. And if Christianity is so incompatible with scientific reason, then how is it that this thing that was so elusive to every other civilization suddenly explodes out of backwards, supposedly dark age promoting Christian civilization? Not only is that a really glaring refutation of the faith versus science narrative, but it's further frustrated by the fact that the list of people that were essential in the advent of science in Europe were almost exclusively Christians working under the patronage of church institutions. Okay, to further illustrate this point, I want you to indulge me in a thought exercise, because us postmodern humans have inherited a lot, and that makes us prone to thinking that our intellectual assumptions and starting points and the things that we take for granted are easy to come by, when in fact they are not. So I want you to imagine that instead of living in this age, you've just emerged from your cave in a prehistoric world. Maybe you're a stereotypical primitive living some 50,000 years ago. The world that you occupy often presents itself in very adversarial ways to you. You don't have a diverse economy or an agricultural system to rely on for your next meal. You have to go and find it yourself out in the wild. And as you do so, you encounter an array of experiences that you don't necessarily understand. Many of your next prospective meals are quite dangerous and difficult to lure and to capture and to kill, and you're competing against predators that would happily rip you to shreds if you get in their way. And very rarely is the weather operating in a way that perfectly suits you. Like some days it's windy and then other days it's rainy. Sometimes it's sunny in the morning and then a raging thunderstorm blows through in the afternoon. Sometimes the land around you is flooding, and then other times it's so arid that nothing will grow. When you look up at the night sky, sometimes you see stars, and then other times they're obscured. Sometimes you look up and you'll see a full moon, and then other times you'll see just a sliver of a crescent moon. You don't own a calendar, so the notion of seasons is utterly foreign to you, and they last for such extended periods of time that it's hard to perceive the patterns if you manage to live through them. This chaotic impression of the world would reinforce at least two things for me. One, that the world is a hostile and frightening place, and number two, that you can't rely on a consistent environment to nurture your efforts. You need to be able to adapt at a moment's notice before the world presents you with all kinds of adversities that you've never even experienced or considered. This is the starting point of human life before it trends towards civilization. And to further complicate our understanding of the world, all of our earliest records of human civilization indicate that they believed that the world was haunted by powerful beings and persons who influenced the behavior of natural phenomena. Now, because we are creatures with cognitive abilities, we've always made it our business to come up with explanations for why things are the way they are. but it wasn't based on the assumption that the world is intelligible. Why would you think that it is without the post-scientific conditioning that you and I enjoy? Without that, the world just appears primarily chaotic. And so that's what they did. Early human communities looked at the world like a hormonal companion that would act according to whatever mood it happened to be in. And since they believed that the world was influenced by powerful beings or persons, it was natural that they would blend those things together. The sea is angry today because it is a god with fluctuating moods. The sun is hot today because it too is a god and it is expressing its mood. And this should help to explain why all the earliest civilizations were pantheistic, which means that they believe that the world is God or gods. Pantheism has always been our default assumption in forming how we interpret the natural world. Far from being a world that is governed by laws, they believe that the world is governed by changing mood swings akin to personality. And with that assumption securely in place, it's no wonder why they didn't attempt to produce anything like the scientific method, which depends on the notion or the belief that the world is governed by laws and is therefore intelligible. That if you observe it and record those observations, it will give you consistent and reliable data which can then be interpreted into laws, rather than observations that portray a nature that is exhibiting benevolent tranquility one day and then throwing a temper tantrum the next day. And yet, here we are on the other side of a scientific revolution that was predicated on the notion that behind all the natural phenomena that we experience are intelligible laws. And we did not come by that conclusion easily. The advent of something like science depended upon a corporate effort of establishing first principles and modes of logic that could be used to interpret whatever observations could be acquired. And if you know anything about the history of philosophy, you know that those standards were not established very easily. It required patronage and infrastructure to make it so that those observations would be possible. And then next, it required an education system that society would deem a worthy enough enterprise that we would sacrifice manpower from necessary things like agriculture and infrastructure for something like academic and intellectual training. That sequence of events, this civilization building, is not something that happens by accident. And it's the reason why something like modern science doesn't appear anywhere outside of Christian Europe. So you might ask, what is it about Christian Europe that made this revolution possible? The first is the fundamental assumption that Christianity provides that pantheism does not, which is that the world is governed by intelligible laws because it was created by a lawgiver, an intelligence. It's what the Greeks called the logos. Christians were able to synthesize what the Greco-Roman world had defined as the ground of all reason and being with the creator in the biblical narratives. And the reason the Greeks weren't able to reconcile their notion of the divine with this concept was because their gods represented a temperamental force in the world rather than an intelligent force behind the creation of the world. And it's this same Christianity that forged a new civilization in Europe that exceeded everything that had come before it, and at the same time provided a unifying force for a continent that is composed of incredibly diverse ethnicities in a way that no other political force has been able to do since then. And it's a bit ironic that the European Union seems to think that the key to unifying Europe is secularism, when in fact it was religion that came closer to unifying Europe than anything else prior to this. And with every risk of a backslide away from civilization and reason, the church was always there as an overarching authority to correct. And of course, there are examples of which the church had abused this authority, but with a reign lasting over 1,000 years, the number of cases that her detractors can point to are seriously scarce. And in spite of all these allusions and countless references to the countless scientific thinkers that were supposedly persecuted by the church, the only example that I ever hear is the Galileo affair. And if in that long reign of the church, this is the only case you can come up with, then this notion that the church was systematically hostile towards science and reason is painfully weak. And I want to dwell on this point for a second, because for comparison's sake, we could look at something like the Soviet Union, which was in power for only not even 100 years compared to the church's 1,000-year reign of influence over life and culture and authority and temporal power in Europe. Only 100 years of the Soviet Union produced estimates as high as 20 million religious victims of the atheistic regime that punished people for not towing the atheistic party line. So those are the kinds of numbers that we should expect if we want to talk about persecution. But in the 1,000-year reign of the church, all we can get is at most a handful of Galileo examples, if even that, and those cases are a lot more complicated than people just being thrown in jail for being religious, or in this case, scientific. If that's all you can come up with, then I think that that's the exception that proves the point that I'm making. So getting back to this sequence of events that led to the scientific revolution, the church dedicated countless amounts of resources and personnel to establish things like universities and hospitals where medical research were done, so that research and reason and knowledge and discovery could be explored with as much resources as they needed. That's why we have things like the Pontifical Academy for the Sciences or the Vatican Observatory. It's why there are over 40 lunar craters that are named after Jesuits. These are things that would not have happened if the church was hostile towards science the way that historical revisionists keep insisting. And it's no wonder why so many significant scientific contributions and discoveries were made by Catholics and Christians, and especially Christian clergymen. And as a final rebuke to this faith versus science conflict thesis, I would invite you to go to the Wikipedia article about Catholic clergy scientists, which just lists them all out. And this page is so long, just to give you an idea of how long it is, they had to alphabetize or add alphabetized navigation to the top just to help you scroll through that much data. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed that, then please consider subscribing and liking, and come find me on Facebook and Twitter. It's a huge help when you do that. It helps us get these videos in front of more and more people. And a big thank you goes out to You Catholic for presenting these videos. And if you want to support the making of these videos, then please consider supporting my work as a digital media and marketing expert. My company, Holdsworth Design, specializes in branding, web and graphic design, marketing, social media, videography, and all that kind of good stuff. So if you know of a parish, a diocese, a ministry, or a business that needs help in those areas, then please send them our way, and I'm sure we can help them out.